In the spring of 1864, at Blackwood Plantation in Lowndes County, Alabama, one of the most brutal and complex massacres in the history of American slavery took place. 11 people were killed in a single night. Among them, patriarch Cornelius Blackwood, found so mutilated it took hours to identify him. Beside him, his wife Magnolia, also violently killed. 3 adult sons, 2 overseers, and others. When investigators arrived, they found a plantation in flames, 187 slaves missing, and a scene of carnage that shocked even Civil War veterans. But the truth behind that massacre would only be revealed decades later. And when it was, it forced the South to confront one of its dirtiest secrets. This is the story of 7 enslaved men, of a white woman turned prisoner, of a pact forged in trauma and blood, of a revenge that took 10 years to materialize, and of a dynasty that fell in a single May night. But it all began 10 years earlier, when a young blacksmith named Solomon arrived at Blackwood Plantation and discovered that not all slaves were black. April 1854. The suffocating heat of Alabama already announced the brutal summer of the Deep South. Blackwood Plantation stretched across 3,200 acres of cotton in the heart of the Black Belt, the richest and cruelest region of the slaveholding South. 187 people lived there in chains. Only 9 were free. Solomon was 22 years old when he was sold to Cornelius Blackwood for $1,200. High price for a slave, but Solomon was a skilled blacksmith, and in Cotton, Alabama, where tools constantly broke under brutal work, a good blacksmith was worth his weight in gold. In the first week, Solomon learned the rules. Wake before sunrise, work until dark, obey without question, look down when white people passed, accept whippings for invisible infractions. Live each day knowing tomorrow might not come. But there was something else at Blackwood Plantation. Something other slaves whispered about when overseers weren't around. Something that made grown men lower their voices and glance nervously toward the big house. Don't look too much at the mistress, warned Moses, the plantation's driver, a 40-year-old slave promoted to supervisor, who walked the thin line between oppressing his own people and keeping everyone alive. And if the master calls you at night, just obey. No matter what he orders you to do. Solomon didn't understand. Not until the first time he saw Magnolia Blackwood. She was 26 years old, but looked 50. Blonde hair that should have gleamed was dull, poorly maintained. Blue eyes that should have commanded were empty, dead inside. Body too thin, as if she hadn't eaten in days. And something more, something in the way she moved, always looking over her shoulder, always hunched, always afraid, like a slave. Is the mistress sick? Solomon asked Isaac, the coachman who had picked him up at the auction in Montgomery the previous week. Isaac's face darkened. He looked around, making sure no one could hear. Then he leaned close, voice barely a whisper. Sick ain't the word for it. That woman. She ain't mistress. She's prisoner. Just like us, maybe worse, Solomon didn't understand. How could a white woman be a prisoner in her own house? But over the following weeks he began to see. The way Magnolia flinched when Cornelius approached. The way she never spoke unless spoken to. The way she disappeared for hours into the slave quarters, returning with tears dried on her face and bruises hidden under long sleeves. And then, 3 months after his arrival, Solomon understood everything. It was a Tuesday night in July. The heat was unbearable, the kind that made breathing feel like drowning. Solomon was finishing work in the blacksmith shop when Moses appeared at the door, face tight with something Solomon couldn't read. Master wants to see you. In the big house now, Solomon's stomach dropped. Being called to the big house at night was never good. It meant punishment, or worse. He followed Moses across the yard, past the whipping post, where dried blood still stained the wood from that morning's discipline, past the cotton gin where James had lost 3 fingers last week, past the slave quarters, where 178 people tried to sleep, despite hunger, pain, and heat. The big house loomed ahead, 3 stories of white columns and southern grandeur built on the backs of the broken. Moses led him to a side entrance, through the kitchen, where the smell of tonight's supper still lingered, food the enslaved had cooked but would never taste. Up a back staircase meant for servants, down a hallway lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, all staring down with the same cold eyes Cornelius had. Moses stopped at a heavy oak door. He turned to Solomon, and for the first time, Solomon saw something in the older man's eyes he'd never seen before. Pity. "Whatever happens in there," Moses whispered, "just do it. Don't fight. Don't refuse. And don't tell nobody, ever." Then he knocked. "Enter." Cornelius Blackwood's voice was smooth, educated, refined. The voice of a man who had never worked a day in his life, who had inherited 3,000 acres and 187 human beings, like other men inherited silverware. Moses opened the door and pushed Solomon inside. The door closed behind him. The room was large, expensively furnished. A four-poster bed dominated one wall. Heavy curtains blocked the windows. And in the center of it all stood Cornelius Blackwood, 52 years old, tall, well-fed, with grey hair and cold blue eyes that looked at Solomon the way a man might look at livestock. "Solomon, my new blacksmith. I hear you're quite skilled." "Yes, master." Solomon kept his eyes down, heart pounding. Good, because I have a special task for you tonight." That's when Solomon saw her. Magnolia Blackwood sat in a chair by the window, wearing a thin white nightgown. Her hands were shaking. Her face was pale. And when she looked at Solomon, he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Terror and apology. "You see, Solomon," Cornelius continued, walking slowly around the room like a predator circling prey, "I believe in experimentation, in observation, in understanding the nature of things. And I've developed a particular interest in a very specific question." He stopped in front of Magnolia, put his hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but didn't move. "What happens when white and black mix? What is produced? Is it human? Is it beast? Is it something in between?" Solomon's stomach twisted. He understood now, and the horror of it made him want to vomit. "So tonight, you're going to help me with an experiment. You're going to lie with my wife, and I'm going to watch. And if you refuse..." Cornelius walked to the nightstand and picked up a small piece of paper. "I'll have your mother sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. I believe she's at the Thompson place, isn't she? 63 years old. Won't last 6 months cutting cane." The room spun. Solomon couldn't breathe. "Or," Cornelius continued, "you can do as I say. Take your time. Be thorough. And your mother stays where she is, safe, fed, alive." There was no choice. There had never been a choice. For the next hour, Solomon lived through a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Forced to perform, while Cornelius watched from a chair in the corner, making notes in a leather journal. Forced to violate a woman who whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over through tears. Forced to become the instrument of a monster's sick curiosity. When it was over, Cornelius dismissed him with a wave of his hand, as if he'd just been shoeing a horse. Solomon stumbled back to the slave quarters, collapsed in his cabin and wept until dawn. But he wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Over the following weeks, Solomon learned the full horror of Blackwood Plantation. Cornelius had been conducting his experiments for 10 years, since the day he married Magnolia in 1844. She had been 16, daughter of a bankrupt plantation owner who sold her to settle debts. Beautiful, educated, from a good family, Cornelius had broken her systematically, first by isolating her from all friends and family, then by humiliating her in front of the house slaves, then by forcing her to watch punishments, to participate in tortures, to become complicit in the machinery of slavery, and finally, by turning her into a slave herself. There were 7 chosen men. 7 slaves Cornelius had selected over the years for his experiments. Moses the driver, Isaac the coachman, Jacob the house servant, Samson the field hand, Cato the carpenter, Jupiter the stable hand, and now Solomon. Once a month, sometimes more, Cornelius would summon one of them, force them to lie with Magnolia while he watched, measured, recorded. Sometimes he brought his sons to watch. Sometimes he invited other plantation owners, showing off his research, and the men had no choice. Refuse, and their families died. Their children were sold. Their mothers were beaten. Their wives were given to the overseers, so they obeyed, and they hated themselves for it. And they hated Cornelius more than they'd ever hated anyone. But worse than the forced coupling was what came after. In 1856, Magnolia became pregnant. Cornelius was ecstatic. His experiment was working. He would finally have proof of his theories about race, about breeding, about the nature of mixed blood. For 9 months, Magnolia's belly grew. And for 9 months, Cornelius documented everything. He forced each of the 7 men to lie with her again, claiming he wanted to confuse the paternity, to see if multiple Negro influences would affect the outcome. The baby was born on a cold January night in 1857, a boy, healthy, crying. Lustily, Magnolia held him for exactly 3 minutes. Then Cornelius took the baby, walked to a basin of water that had been prepared in the corner, and held the infant under until he stopped moving. "There," Cornelius said, dropping the tiny body into the water like it was garbage. Proof that white and Negro produce monstrosity. Note the dark skin, the coarse hair, not fully human, not fully beast. An abomination. Magnolia's screams echoed through the big house for hours. By morning, she had stopped making sounds altogether. That night, something changed in the 7 men. The shame that had kept them broken, the self-hatred that had kept them compliant, the horror that had kept them silent, it all transformed into something else. Pure, cold rage. Moses found them one by one over the following week. Whispered meetings in the darkness, careful coded conversations while working, and finally, a gathering in the abandoned chapel at the far edge of the plantation, a building that hadn't been used since the previous master had died 20 years before. All 7 men. And Magnolia, she had come of her own accord, slipping out of the big house in the dead of night. When she entered the chapel, the men fell silent. They had never spoken to her outside of the forced encounters, never acknowledged what happened, never looked her in the eye, but now she stood before them, thin and broken, but with something new in her eyes. Fire. "I don't blame you," she said, voice hoarse from disuse. "I want you to know that. None of this is your fault. We are all his victims. All of us, black and white, slave and wife. He destroyed us all." Solomon stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, Magnolia. Just Magnolia. I'm not mistress of anything. I'm a prisoner. Like you." The 7 men looked at each other. Then Moses spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of forced complicity. "What do you want from us?" Magnolia's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. "Revenge, justice, freedom, and end to this hell." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small leather journal. Cornelius's journal, the one where he documented his experiments. "I've been reading this for years, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, his fears." She opened it to a page filled with dates and descriptions. "He documents everything. Every slave he's tortured, every family he's separated, every woman he's raped, every child he's killed. It's all here." She looked up at the 7 men, and in that moment they saw not a white mistress, but a fellow conspirator, a survivor, a warrior. "The war is coming. You can feel it. The abolitionists in the north are getting stronger. The south is dividing. And when it comes, when the chaos comes, we strike." "Strike how?" Jacob asked, the house servant who had been subjected to Cornelius's experiments for 8 years. Magnolia's eyes hardened. "We kill them all, Cornelius, his 3 sons, the overseers, every man who has participated in or enabled this nightmare. We burn this place to the ground, and then we run north to freedom." "They'll hunt us," Cato said quietly. "They'll hang us, burn us, make examples of us." "Maybe," Magnolia agreed. "But I'd rather die free than live one more day as his toy." "Wouldn't you?" Silence filled the chapel. Outside, a nightbird called. In the distance, a dog barked. The sounds of a plantation sleeping, unaware that in this abandoned building a revolution was being born. Moses spoke first. "How long we got to wait?" "Years," Magnolia said. "Maybe 5, maybe 10, but we wait. We prepare, we gather weapons, we recruit others. We learn every detail of this plantation until we know it better than Cornelius does. And when the moment is right, when the war comes and the South is distracted, we strike." "Why should we trust you?" Samson asked, the field hand who had spent 12 years under the whip. "You're one of them, am I?" Magnolia's voice was bitter. "I haven't spoken to another free person in 10 years. I haven't left this plantation in a decade. I watch while men are tortured. I was forced to watch my baby murdered. I'm raped monthly by my own husband's design. Tell me, Samson, Am I really one of them? Or am I just another slave with white skin? The question hung in the air. Then Solomon pulled out his blacksmith knife, a pact then, sworn in blood. When the time comes, we act together. We trust each other. We protect each other. And we don't stop until every one of them is dead. One by one, the 7 men came forward. Each cut their palm. Each let blood drip onto the chapel floor. And finally, Magnolia took the knife and did the same. 8 hands clasped together, blood mixing, 8 voices speaking as one. For the child who died. For the dignity stolen. For the humanity they tried to destroy. For every soul who suffered in this hell, we swear they will pay, every one of them. And when that day comes, there will be no mercy, no forgiveness, no escape. This we swear on our blood and our lives. The pact was made. The conspiracy was born, and for the next 10 years, they waited. If you're feeling rage right now, you should. This was real. These horrors happened in America on American soil, protected by American law. And the revenge that's coming, it was born from a decade of forced patience, of careful planning, of 8 broken people who refused to stay broken. The years between 1857 and 1864 moved slowly at Blackwood Plantation, each day a careful performance, each night a secret preparation. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Cotton grew, slaves worked. The Blackwood family prospered, but underneath the surface, a machine of vengeance was being built, piece by piece, drop by drop. Each of the 7 men had a role. Each understood that their individual survival meant nothing if the plan failed. They were no longer individuals. They were a weapon, and Magnolia was the one who aimed them. Solomon, the blacksmith, began his work in plain sight. Every broken tool he repaired, he made another. Hidden weapons, forged in the dead of night when the overseer thought he was doing legitimate work. Machetes sharpened to razor edges, axes with weighted heads, chains that could crush a skull. He built a false bottom in his tool chest, where he hid them, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. By 1864, he had 47 weapons, enough to arm every slave who would join them when the time came. Moses, as driver, had the most dangerous position, and the most valuable. He was Cornelius's eyes and ears in the quarters, the man who reported infractions, who controlled work assignments, who held power over life and death. The other slaves hated him. They called him traitor, collaborator, master's dog. But Moses used that position brilliantly. He mapped every routine on the plantation. He knew when Cornelius woke, when he ate, when he drank, when he was alone. He knew which overseers were heavy sleepers and which were light. He knew the schedules of visitors, the patterns of patrols, the weak points in plantation security. And he documented everything. Storing it all in his perfect memory since he couldn't write, he also recruited, carefully, slowly, testing slaves with carefully worded questions, watching reactions, learning who could be trusted. By 1864, he had identified 23 slaves who were ready to fight, who would kill when the moment came, who would rather die free than live one more day in chains. Isaac, the coachman, knew every road within 50 miles. He had driven Cornelius to neighboring plantations, to town, to Montgomery. He knew which routes were patrolled and which weren't. He knew where the swamps were deepest, where the rivers could be forded, where the woods were thick enough to hide in. He also knew how to disable every horse on the plantation. A small nail driven just right into a hoof would lame a horse for weeks. A particular herb mixed into feed would cause colic. He had planned the exact sequence. On the night they acted, every horse except the 7 fastest would be useless, and those 7 would be waiting with saddles in the woods, ready for escape. Jacob, the house servant, had the most intimate access to the family. He served their meals, cleaned their rooms, overheard their conversations. And over the years, he had stolen a little at a time. A spoonful of arsenic from the rat poison kept in the basement. A knife from the kitchen, a key to the gun cabinet, carefully copied in wax and given to Solomon to forge. Most importantly, he had access to Magnolia. They developed a code, communicating through the placement of objects in her room. A candlestick on the left meant Cornelius would be out that evening. A book on the nightstand meant visitors were coming. A certain flower in the vase meant danger. Abort all plans, and he collected the arsenic. Drop by drop, theft so small it would never be noticed. By 1864, he had enough to kill 20 men. Samson, the field hand, did the hardest work and had the least freedom. But he was strong, the strongest man on the plantation, and he was respected among the field slaves. When Moses recruited, Samson confirmed. His word meant something. If Samson said these men could be trusted, they could be trusted. He also trained them. In the woods, during the brief Sunday rest period, he taught them to fight, how to use a blade, how to kill silently, how to move in darkness. The overseers thought the slaves were praying or resting. They were learning to be soldiers. Cato, the carpenter, built the escape routes. He repaired the back fence, leaving sections that could be removed in seconds. He built a false wall in one of the storage barns, creating a hiding place large enough for 15 people. He modified the loft in the stable so that the ladder could be pulled up, making it a fortress if needed. And he created the hideouts beyond the plantation. In the swamp, in the deep woods, he built 3 camps. Just platforms in trees, covered with leaves, invisible from the ground. Stocked with dried food, stolen bit by bit, with water jugs, with blankets. If they had to scatter and hide, they had places to go. Jupiter, the stable hand, cared for the horses, but also managed the dogs. Blackwood Plantation had 12 bloodhounds, bred and trained for tracking runaway slaves. Jupiter fed them, trained them, and slowly, carefully, taught them that he was master, not the overseers. He also learned their weaknesses. Which dogs were afraid of fire, which could be distracted with meat, which would follow a false trail. On the night of the escape, Jupiter would release all 12 dogs in the wrong direction, chasing a trail he'd laid with deer blood and rabbit fur. By the time the overseers figured out the deception, the escapees would have hours of head start, and Magnolia orchestrated it all. From her prison in the big house, she gathered intelligence. She listened to Cornelius's conversations with visiting plantation owners. She read his correspondence when he left his study unlocked. She learned about the war, about troop movements, about which areas were under Union control and which weren't. She also documented everything in a ledger she kept hidden in a hollowed-out book. Every crime Cornelius committed, every slave he tortured, every woman he raped, including the house slaves he assaulted when he grew bored with his experiments. Every family he separated, every child he sold. 40 pages of detailed crimes, names, dates, descriptions, if they survived, if they made it north. This ledger would be her testimony, proof of the horrors of Blackwood Plantation. But the worst part of those 10 years wasn't the planning. It was the continued abuse. Cornelius didn't stop his experiments. Once a month, sometimes more, he would summon one of the 7. And they had to comply, had to continue the performance, had to endure the humiliation while dreaming of the day they would make him pay. Magnolia endured it by thinking of the knife she would use to cut his throat. The men endured it by remembering their vow. Each violation was fuel for the fire that would consume the Blackwoods. In 1859, Magnolia became pregnant again. This time, all 7 men knew what would happen. They knew Cornelius would wait until the birth, then murder the infant like he had murdered the first. And there was nothing they could do to stop it without revealing the conspiracy. The baby, a girl, was born in March 1860. She lived 4 minutes before Cornelius drowned her in the same basin he'd used for the first. That night, alone in her room, Magnolia sharpened a knife and carved a single word into the wooden floor beneath her bed, where no one would see it. Soon, the war came in 1861. Fort Sumter fell. The South seceded. Alabama joined the Confederacy, and Blackwood Plantation continued as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. 2 overseers left to join the Confederate Army. They were replaced by older men, less competent, less alert. Cornelius's 3 sons, Nathaniel, Beauregard, and Montgomery, ages 28, 26, and 23, stayed home, claiming plantation management was essential to the war effort. In truth, they were cowards. As the war progressed, conditions on the plantation worsened. Food became scarce. Punishments increased. Cornelius grew paranoid, seeing rebellion everywhere. In 1863, he hanged 3 slaves for suspicious behavior. They had done nothing except talk quietly among themselves, but the paranoia made him sloppy. He drank more. He slept less well. His routines became erratic. The perfect order of the plantation began to fray, and the 8 conspirators saw their opportunity approaching. In April 1864, news came that Union General Sherman was advancing through Georgia. The South was losing. Panic spread through Alabama's plantation country. Some owners began moving slaves inland, away from potential Union lines. Others armed themselves, preparing for slave uprisings. Cornelius did both. He bought more guns, he hired additional guards, and he grew more brutal, believing that increased terror would prevent rebellion. He was wrong. On May 10, 1864, Magnolia placed a red flower in the vase in her window. The signal, 4 days, midnight, May 14th, the preparations went into overdrive. Solomon distributed weapons. Moses briefed the 23 recruits. Isaac prepared the horses. Jacob made final checks of the arsenic doses. Samson gathered the fighters. Cato opened the escape routes. Jupiter prepared to release the dogs. On May 13th, there was one final meeting. All 8 gathered in the abandoned chapel one last time. It was midnight, a moonless night, the darkness complete. They stood in a circle, holding hands. "Tomorrow night," Magnolia said, voice steady, "we end this. All of it. No one survives from the family. No one who enabled this. No one who participated. Total destruction. And after?" Jacob asked. "After we run. Some of us will make it. Some won't. But every one of us will die free. Even if that freedom only lasts one night." Solomon squeezed her hand. "What about you?" Magnolia smiled, and it was the saddest thing any of them had ever seen. "I'm not leaving. I can't. Everything that's happened here, it broke something in me that can't be fixed. I don't want to carry these memories into a new life. I don't want to live with what was done to me, to us, to our children. When you kill them, kill me too. Make it quick. Make it painless. And let me finally be free." "Magnolia," Moses started, "please. It's the only thing I'm asking. You'll give me peace. Real peace. The kind I haven't known in 20 years. They tried to argue, but looking in her eyes, they understood. Some wounds go too deep. Some violations can't be survived, even when the body lives on. "All right," Solomon said finally. "When it's done, I'll do it. I promise it won't hurt. Thank you." Magnolia pulled out Cornelius's journal and her own ledger. "Take these. When you reach the north, give them to the abolitionists. Let the world know what happened here. Every detail, every name. Make sure they can never pretend this didn't happen." She looked around the circle at the 7 men who had become her only family. "I love you all. You know that, right? You're the bravest men I've ever known. And when this is over, when I'm gone, don't remember me as a victim. Remember me as a soldier, as someone who fought back, as someone who chose how her story ended." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then, one by one, they renewed their blood oath, cutting palms, letting blood drip, swearing once more, "Tomorrow, midnight, justice comes." Pause for a moment. "Tomorrow night, 7 enslaved men and 1 enslaved white woman will commit one of the most brutal massacres in Southern history. They will kill 11 people. They will burn a dynasty to the ground, and some of them will die for it, but they will die free. If you're ready to witness justice, terrible, bloody, necessary justice, leave your like. And remember, this really happened. May 14th, 1864 dawned hot and humid, the kind of oppressive Alabama heat that made breathing feel like drowning. The cotton fields shimmered in the sun. The slaves worked in silence, bent under overseers' eyes, looking like they did every day, but underneath that silence, every one of the 23 conspirators was counting down. 16 hours, 12 hours, 8 hours. Cornelius Blackwood spent the day reviewing plantation accounts, frustrated by declining cotton prices and the chaos of wartime economy. His 3 sons rode the property, playing at being overseers. His wife, his prisoner, sat in her room, staring out the window at the quarters below. 6 hours, 4 hours. As the sun began to set, Jacob served dinner to the family. Roasted chicken, potatoes, greens grown and cooked by slaves who would never taste them. He moved mechanically, pouring wine, refilling plates, invisible as furniture. But as he poured Cornelius's 3rd glass of bourbon, he let 2 drops of arsenic fall into it. Not enough to kill, just enough to slow him down, to make him slightly clumsy, slightly confused. Cornelius drank it without noticing. 2 hours. At 10 p.m., the plantation settled into sleep. The field slaves in their quarters, the house slaves in their rooms, the overseers in their cabins, the family in the big house, but 7 men didn't sleep. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, gathering weapons, taking positions, preparing for midnight, 1 hour, 30 minutes. In her room, Magnolia dressed in black. She opened the drawer where she kept Cornelius's journal and her ledger. She wrapped them in oilcloth, ready to be carried north. Then she picked up the knife she had hidden under her mattress 10 years ago and slipped it into her belt. 15 minutes. Moses stood at the edge of the quarters, watching the big house. Behind him, 23 men waited, armed with Solomon's weapons, ready to surge forward when the signal came. 5 minutes. The plantation was silent. No moon, no stars visible through cloud cover. The darkness was complete, providential. Midnight. Solomon walked to the blacksmith shop and rang the bell. On long, clear toll, the signal. Everything happened at once. Moses and his 23 men surged toward the big house, surrounding it, cutting off all escape routes. They moved in practiced silence, the result of years of Sunday training sessions disguised as prayer meetings. Isaac and Jupiter ran to the overseers' cabins. 2 overseers remained on the plantation. The others had gone to war and not returned. Old men hired because younger ones weren't available. The first overseer, Thomas Pritchard, had tortured slaves for 30 years. He had a collection of whips in his cabin, each designed for maximum pain. He had personally overseen the whipping death of 12 people, including 2 pregnant women. Isaac kicked in the door. Pritchard woke, reaching for the rifle beside his bed. But Isaac was faster. He grabbed the man's own bullwhip from the wall and wrapped it around his throat. "Remember Moses?" Isaac hissed, pulling tight. "The 16-year-old you whipped to death for stealing bread?" "He was my nephew," Pritchard struggled, clawing at the leather around his neck. But Isaac was 40 years younger and fueled by 20 years of rage. He pulled tighter, tighter, until Pritchard's face turned purple, until his body went limp, until the man who had killed 12 was dead himself. But Isaac wasn't done. He dragged the body outside to the whipping post, where Pritchard had dispensed so much agony. He tied the corpse to the post, then picked up one of Pritchard's own whips, and he delivered 200 lashes to the dead body. One for each person Pritchard had whipped over his career. The other overseer, Robert Kane, met a different fate. Jupiter found him sleeping off his evening whiskey, snoring in his bunk. Jupiter had prepared for this moment carefully. In his hand was a cotton hook, the same tool Kane had used to permanently maim 3 slaves by accidentally catching them while they worked. Jupiter didn't hesitate. He drove the hook into Kane's chest, hooked the ribcage, and pulled. The man woke screaming, but Jupiter had stuffed a rag in his mouth first. The scream came out muffled, useless. "For Benjamin," Jupiter said quietly, twisting the hook. "For Samuel. For Ruth. You took their bodies. I take yours." Kane died slowly, drowning in his own blood, unable to scream, unable to fight, finally understanding the helplessness he had inflicted on so many others. At the big house, Cato and Samson moved to the 2nd floor, where the 3 Blackwood sons slept. Nathaniel Blackwood, the eldest at 28, had raped 42 enslaved women. He kept a record of his conquests in a journal, rating them like livestock. He had fathered 19 children among the enslaved population and sold every one of them before their first birthday. Cato found him sleeping in silk sheets, in a bed worth more than every slave on the plantation combined. He put a hand over Nathaniel's mouth as his eyes opened. "Remember Dinah," Cato whispered. "The 15-year-old you raped last month? She tried to kill herself after. She failed. But she told me everything you did to her, every detail." Nathaniel tried to fight, but Cato was 50 pounds heavier and far stronger. He pulled out the machete Solomon had forged and raised it high. "This is for Dinah, and for every girl you destroyed." The blade came down, once, twice, 3 times. Nathaniel Blackwood died in pieces, the way he had destroyed so many lives, piece by piece. In the next room, Beauregard Blackwood, 26, woke to find Samson standing over him with an axe. Beauregard had a particular cruelty. He liked to work slaves in the hottest part of the day, denying them water, seeing how long they could last. 2 had died of heat stroke under his supervision. He had laughed both times. "Please," Beauregard begged. "I'll free you. I'll sign papers. I'll give you money. Anything except give back the lives you took," Samson said. And he brought the axe down on Beauregard's skull, splitting it like firewood. Montgomery Blackwood, the youngest at 23, died the fastest. Jacob found him in his room and simply slit his throat, efficient and quick. Not because Montgomery was less guilty. He had participated in his father's experiments, had watched and documented, had suggested new tortures, but because there was no time for elaborate revenge. They had a schedule to keep. 3 sons dead in 3 minutes. Now only Cornelius remained. Solomon and Moses climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. They found the door locked, but Solomon had the key Jacob had stolen and copied years ago. They entered silently. Cornelius was sitting in a chair by the window, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He had heard the commotion. He knew what was happening. The arsenic in his system made him slow, fuzzy, unable to stand or reach for the rifle that leaned against the wall 5 feet away. He looked up as they entered, and for the first time in his life, Cornelius Blackwood felt true fear. "You," he said, voice slurred. "You dare—" "Shut your mouth," Moses said quietly. "Your time for talking is over." Behind them, Magnolia entered the room. She had walked through the big house, past the bodies of the 3 sons she had watched grow into monsters, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. When Cornelius saw her, something like understanding crossed his face. You planned this. You turned my property against me." "Your property?" Magnolia's laugh was bitter as poison. "I was never your property, Cornelius. I was your wife, until you turned me into something else, something less than human, just like you did to them." She gestured to Solomon and Moses. "And now we're taking back what you stole. Our humanity, our dignity, our right to exist without your boot on our necks." Cornelius tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The arsenic had done its work. He slumped back in the chair, breathing hard. "You'll hang for this. All of you. They'll hunt you down like the animals you are." "Maybe," Solomon said, walking forward. "But you won't live to see it." He pulled out the rope he'd brought. Heavy hemp rope, the same kind used to bind slaves at auction, to tie runaways to whipping posts, to hang those who dared resist. "What? What are you doing?" Cornelius's voice rose with panic. "Giving you time to think," Moses said. "About every person you tortured, every family you destroyed, every life you took." They bound him to the chair, tight, professional. Then they dragged the chair to the center of the room and positioned it facing the bed. That's when the door opened again, and the other 4 entered. Isaac, Jacob, Cato, Jupiter, all 7 together for the first time in Cornelius's presence, not as victims, but as executioners. Cornelius looked at them, and finally, understanding dawned. These weren't 7 random slaves. These were the 7 he had used for his experiments. The 7 he had forced to violate his wife while he watched and documented. "The experiment is over," Magnolia said softly. "And the results are in. You created this. Every action we take tonight is your doing. You planted seeds of rage for 10 years. Now you harvest them." She walked to the nightstand and opened the drawer. From it, she pulled out Cornelius's own journal, the leather-bound book where he had documented his experiments, his tortures, his rapes, his murders. 40 pages, she said, holding it up. 40 pages of crimes detailed, dated, in your own handwriting. Every slave you killed. Every woman you raped, every child you sold, every experiment you conducted, everything. She threw it on the bed. "This goes north with them, so the world knows. So there's proof, so no one can ever say we were the monsters." Cornelius stared at the journal, then at the 7 men surrounding him. His face had gone from red to white. "Please, I'm a man of means. I can pay you, each of you, $1,000 more, freedom papers, transportation north, anything." "We don't want your money," Solomon said. "Money is what made you think you could own us, that you could buy and sell human beings like cattle, that you could torture and kill without consequence because you had the law on your side." He pulled out the knife he'd forged specifically for this moment. 10 inches of perfectly balanced steel. "Tonight, the only law is justice. And you've been judged by slaves?" Cornelius spat, some of his old arrogance returning. I'm a civilized man. You're animals, property. You have no right to judge me. We have every right, Magnolia said, because we're the only ones who truly know what you are. Not the gentleman planter your neighbors see. Not the successful businessman. Not the pillar of the community. We know you're a monster, and monsters must be destroyed. She looked at the 7 men. He's yours. All of yours. Every man takes a piece. For every violation, every humiliation, every time he stole your humanity. Take it back. What happened next took 47 minutes. Each of the 7 men approached in turn. Each took something from Cornelius Blackwood, a physical piece to represent everything he had taken from them. Moses went first. He pulled out a small blade and approached Cornelius, who was now struggling against the ropes, panic overwhelming him completely. You took my dignity, Moses said. Made me overseer so I'd betray my people. Made me your eyes and ears. Made them hate me. Made me hate myself. He grabbed Cornelius's right hand and sawed off the index finger. Cornelius screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the house. That's the finger you used to point, to give orders, to designate who would be whipped, to play God with our lives. You don't need it anymore. Isaac went next. The coachman, who had been forced to drive Cornelius to business meetings, to appear subservient, to pretend everything was normal while his soul died inside. You took my voice, made me silent, made me smile while I bled inside. He cut out Cornelius's tongue. The screaming became gurgling. Blood poured from Cornelius's mouth. But the arsenic kept him conscious, kept him aware. That was the terrible mercy of the poison. It slowed everything down, prevented shock from granting him escape into unconsciousness. Jacob approached next. The house servant who had been closest to the family, who had seen every private moment of cruelty. You took my trust, made me serve you, made me complicit. He carved away Cornelius's ears. Now you can't hear, can't receive orders, can't pretend you don't know what's happening. Samson, the field hand, went forth. He had spent 12 years in the cotton fields, back permanently bent, hands permanently scarred. You took my strength, worked me like an animal, took my youth and my health. He broke both of Cornelius's legs with a hammer. The sounds of bone cracking filled the room. Cornelius tried to scream, but could only make wet, gurgling sounds. Cato approached, the carpenter who had built everything on the plantation, including the whipping post where so many had died. You took my skill, made me build the instruments of torture, made my hands create pain. He removed Cornelius's eyes with surgical precision, learned from years of detailed woodwork. Now Cornelius was blind, deaf, mute, broken, but still alive, still conscious, still aware through touch and pain that he was being destroyed piece by piece. Jupiter came 6th, the stable hand who had cared for animals and watched them be treated better than humans. You took our families, sold children, separated husbands from wives, destroyed bonds you had no right to touch. He castrated Cornelius with the same tools used to geld horses. Finally, Solomon approached. The blacksmith who had arrived 10 years ago and been thrown immediately into the nightmare, who had been forced to be the first new addition to Cornelius's sick experiment. You took everything, Solomon said quietly. Our bodies, our choices, our humanity. You took a baby's life just to prove your twisted theories. You took a woman's soul. You took 7 men's dignity. You took hundreds of people's freedom. He raised the knife he'd forged. So I take your life. And I do it slowly, so you feel every second of what we've felt for years. Terror, pain, helplessness, the knowledge that you're going to die, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. He began cutting. Small cuts, precise, letting blood flow but not enough to kill quickly. Cornelius's body convulsed in the chair, but the ropes held. The man who had controlled so many lives had no control over his own death. For 47 minutes, Solomon cut, and he talked, listing names. Every slave Cornelius had killed, every woman he'd raped, every child he'd sold, every family he'd destroyed. Sarah died from infection after you whipped her for breaking a plate. She was 9 years old. Cut. Benjamin, worked to death in the cotton gin, 23 years old. Cut. Dinah, raped by your son. She was 15. Cut. Moses Jr., sold to a sugar plantation, 8 years old, cut, on and on, 47 names, 47 cuts, until Cornelius. Blackwood was more blood than man, more corpse than living thing. Finally, Solomon raised the knife one last time, and this is for the baby, the one you drowned, the one who never got a name, the one whose only crime was being born. He drove the knife through Cornelius's heart. The body stopped moving. The gurgling stopped. After 52 years of inflicting suffering, Cornelius Blackwood was dead. The 7 men stepped back. They were covered in blood. The room was drenched in it. The smell of death was overwhelming, but none of them felt regret, only exhaustion, and a strange, hollow sense of completion. Magnolia had watched the entire execution in silence. Now she walked to Cornelius's corpse and looked down at what remained. 10 years, she said softly. 10 years I waited for this moment. I thought I'd feel something. Joy, satisfaction, relief. But I feel empty. He took so much that even his death can't fill the void. She turned to Solomon. I'm ready now. Please, keep your promise. Solomon looked at the other 6 men. They nodded. They understood. Some wounds were too deep. Some souls were too shattered. Magnolia had earned the right to choose her own ending. Thank you, she said, pulling them each into an embrace. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being the family I chose, the only family that mattered. She lay down on the bed, closed her eyes, and smiled. Finally, she whispered, finally free. Solomon knelt beside her. He put his hand over hers. I'll make it quick, I promise. I know. That's why I asked you. The knife was sharp. The cut was clean. Magnolia Blackwood died in less than 3 seconds, painlessly, surrounded by the only people who had truly loved her. The 7 men stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the woman who had orchestrated their revenge, and then chosen to die rather than live with the memories. We honor her, Moses said finally. We tell her story. We make sure the world knows she wasn't mistress, she was prisoner, and she died a warrior. They took Cornelius's journal and Magnolia's ledger. Then they set fire to the master bedroom. As flames began to spread, they ran downstairs. Outside, the 23 recruits had gathered, having completed their tasks. 2 overseers dead, 3 sons dead, 4 other white men who had been visiting the plantation, buyers looking to purchase slaves, also dead. None had been given mercy. 11 total, Moses reported. Every white man on the property, every one who participated in or enabled this hell. Solomon looked around at the gathered slaves. 30 men total who had actively participated, and another 157 who had simply scattered into the night when the violence began, taking the opportunity to escape. Take what you need. Food, weapons, clothes. But move fast. We have maybe 2 hours before someone notices the fire. The slaves moved with purpose, looting the big house of everything useful. They took all the food from the pantry, all the weapons from the gun cabinet, all the money from Cornelius's safe, $3,800, which they divided among the fighters. They freed all the horses that Jupiter hadn't lamed for the purpose of preventing pursuit. 7 fast horses for the 7 men who had orchestrated the revenge. The others would travel on foot but in groups, with weapons, with supplies. As the big house burned behind them, Solomon gathered the 7 one final time. We split here, safer that way, harder to track, but we each carry part of the story. He held up the journals. Moses, you head west toward Texas. Maybe find your way to Mexico. They don't have slavery there. Moses nodded. Isaac, you know the roads. Take 5 men and go toward Montgomery. There's Union sympathizers there who'll help. Isaac clasped his shoulder. Jacob, you take the journals. You can read and write. Get them north, to the abolitionists, to Frederick Douglass if you can. Make sure they publish every word. Jacob took the oilcloth-wrapped books reverently. Cato, take the big group. 20 people. Head for the swamp. You know where the camps are. Hide there until the chaos passes. The war's almost over. Freedom's coming whether we make it north or not. Cato nodded grimly. Jupiter, you take the dogs and head south, then loop north. Lay false trails. Keep them chasing ghosts. Jupiter grinned. It was the first time any of them had seen him smile in 10 years. "Samson, you're the fighter. Take 10 men and head directly north, fast and hard. Fight anyone who tries to stop you. Make it to Union lines. Enlist if you can. Fight against the Confederacy officially." Samson clasped his forearm. "It'll be an honor. And me," Solomon said, "I'll head east toward Georgia. Sherman's there, Union troops. I'll find them. I'll tell them what happened here. I'll make sure there's a witness who survives." The 7 men stood in a circle one last time, placed their hands together, hands still covered in Cornelius Blackwood's blood. "For the baby," they said in unison. "For Magnolia. For every soul who suffered here. We did it, and we don't regret it." Then they scattered into the darkness. Behind them, Blackwood Plantation burned. If you're feeling something powerful right now, if your heart is pounding, if you're questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and revenge and right and wrong, you're supposed to. This is the truth they don't teach in schools. This is the history that's been buried. Leave your like if this story shook you, and stay with me, because what happened next is just as important as what happened that night. The fire at Blackwood Plantation burned until dawn. By sunrise on May 15, 1864, there was nothing left but charred timber and ash. The big house was gone. The barns were gone. 300 years of Blackwood legacy reduced to smoke and memory. The bodies of Cornelius and Magnolia Blackwood were found in the master bedroom, or what was left of them. The fire had been so intense that identification was only possible by location and size. The other 9 bodies, 3 sons, 2 overseers, 4 visitors, were found throughout the property, each one bearing evidence of violent death. The first person to discover the massacre was a neighboring plantation owner, Colonel James Pemberton, who rode over that morning to discuss crop prices. He found the main gate open, the plantation deserted, and smoke still rising from the ruins. What he saw when he entered the property made him vomit. Then he rode his horse nearly to death getting back to town. By noon, word had spread through Lowndes County like wildfire. By evening, it had reached Montgomery. By the next day, the entire state of Alabama knew. Slave uprising. 11 white people murdered, an entire plantation destroyed. Every slave escaped. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Terror gripped the white population. If it could happen at Blackwood, a well-run plantation with experienced overseers and a master known for maintaining discipline, it could happen anywhere. Within 24 hours, martial law was declared in Lowndes County. Within 48 hours, the governor had authorized 500 Confederate soldiers to hunt down the escapees. Within a week, the reward for any of the Blackwood 7, as they were now being called, had reached $15,000 total. More money than most Southerners would see in a lifetime. The manhunt was massive. Bloodhounds by the dozen, slave catchers from 3 states, Confederate cavalry, local militias, nearly 800 men searching for 30 fugitives. But the chaos of the war worked in the fugitives' favor. Sherman was advancing through Georgia. Grant was pressing Lee in Virginia. The Confederacy was collapsing. Resources that might have been dedicated entirely to the manhunt were diverted to the war effort. Still, 3 of the 7 would never taste full freedom. Moses headed west toward Texas as planned. He traveled alone, moving at night, hiding during the day. He made it 300 miles before a slave patrol caught him near the Mississippi border. They recognized him from wanted posters. The reward for Moses alone was $3,000. He was identified as the ringleader. Based on his position as driver, they chained him and brought him back to Lowndes County for public trial and execution. The trial took 30 minutes. All-white jury, no defense attorney. Verdict decided before it began. Guilty, death by hanging. Sentenced to be carried out immediately as deterrent to other slaves. They built a special gallows in the town square, forced every enslaved person within 20 miles to attend. This was meant to be a lesson, a warning. This is what happens when you rise up, when you forget your place, when you dare to kill white people. Moses was led to the gallows on June 3, 1864. He was 43 years old. His back bore the scars of 1,000 whippings. His hands were calloused from 30 years of work he'd never been paid for. His face was calm. They asked if he had any last words. Moses looked out at the crowd of enslaved people forced to watch. And he smiled. "I killed him," he said clearly. "Cornelius Blackwood. I cut off his finger, and I'd do it again. I'd do it 100 times, because he deserved to die, and I deserve to be free." "We all do," the white observers shouted him down, called him animal, monster, demon. But the enslaved people in the crowd heard him, and they understood. The trapdoor opened. Moses dropped. His neck broke cleanly, but even in death his words echoed. "I'd do it again." Jacob was caught in Alabama in late June, still carrying the journals. He had been making his way north, trading the documents to abolitionists along the Underground Railroad, having them copy passages before he moved on. When Confederate soldiers found him, the journals were still in his possession. They read Cornelius's confessions, the rapes, the murders, the experiments, and their reaction wasn't horror at the crimes. It was rage that a slave would dare possess such documents. They burned the journals on the spot. Then they burned Jacob alive. They tied him to a post in the center of a small Alabama town and set fire to the wood piled around his feet. They wanted it to be slow, wanted it to be agonizing, wanted every slave in the region to see what happened to those who kept records, who documented, who bore witness. Jacob died on July 12, 1864. He was 38 years old, and he died screaming. But what the Confederates didn't know was that Jacob had already succeeded. Before his capture, he had passed copies of the most damning passages to 7 different abolitionists along his route. Portions of Cornelius's journal and Magnolia's ledger had already been published in northern newspapers. The evidence had already spread. Jacob's death destroyed the originals, but the truth had already escaped. Cato reached the swamp with his group of 20. They built a camp in the deepest part of the bayou, on platforms in the trees, invisible from ground level. They survived there for 18 months, fishing, hunting, living free. But in November 1865, 7 months after the war ended, a former Confederate soldier who'd become a bounty hunter found their camp. Apparently, the reward money was still good, even though slavery had ended. There was a battle. Cato and his people fought with everything they had. They killed 3 of the bounty hunters, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Cato died defending his people. Shot 7 times. He fell from the tree platform into the black water of the swamp and was never recovered. But of the 20 people he'd led into the swamp, 14 survived. 14 people who lived free for those 18 months, who saw slavery end, who got to live as free people even if just for a short time. The other 4 of the 7 had better fortune. Jupiter, using his knowledge of dogs and tracking, managed to lead pursuers on a months-long wild goose chase across Alabama and Mississippi. He finally shook them in Tennessee and made it to Union lines in October 1864. From there, he disappeared. Rumor says he made it to Canada. Another rumor says he enlisted in a black Union regiment under a false name and fought at the Battle of Nashville. A third says he went west to the territories where no one cared about bounty notices from a dying Confederacy. No one knows for sure. But no one ever collected the bounty on Jupiter, which means he was never caught. He simply vanished into freedom. Samson, the fighter, did exactly what he promised. He led his 10 men north, fought through 2 Confederate patrols, and reached Union lines in Georgia in late June. All 11 men enlisted in the 54th United States Colored Infantry. Samson fought in 6 battles, was wounded twice, survived the war. After Lee's surrender in April 1865, Samson mustered out with an honorable discharge. He settled in Philadelphia, changed his name to Samuel Freeman, married, had 4 children, and lived until 1889. He was one of the few who got to live the full life that slavery had tried to deny him. And according to his grandchildren's oral history, he never once regretted the night of May 14th, 1864. Isaac, the coachman who knew every road, used that knowledge brilliantly. He and his group of 5 made it to Montgomery within 4 days, connected with Underground Railroad conductors, and were moved north through a network of safe houses. By July, Isaac was in Ohio. By August, he was in Canada. He settled in a small community of formerly enslaved people outside Toronto, married a woman who had also escaped slavery, worked as a carpenter, but in 1867, Isaac made a fatal mistake. He returned to the United States to help his sister escape from Tennessee. Confederate sympathizers recognized him, and though the war was over, though slavery was ended, the hatred remained. Isaac was killed in a street in Nashville, shot in the back by a man who'd been a slave catcher and couldn't accept that the old order was dead. He was 38 years old. He died free, but he died for the same reason he'd been enslaved, because of white supremacy that couldn't let go. And Solomon, the blacksmith who had been the first new addition to Cornelius's nightmarish experiments, the man who had killed Cornelius Blackwood with his own hands, Solomon rode east as planned. He reached Sherman's army in Georgia in June 1864. He told his story to a Union officer, who was so disturbed he passed Solomon up the chain of command. Eventually, Solomon told his story to a war correspondent, who published it in a Boston newspaper. The article caused a sensation. Even Northerners, who supported slavery's end, were shocked by the details. Cornelius's experiments, the forced couplings, the murdered babies, Magnolia's imprisonment and eventual death. The article was titled The Blackwood Horror, inside the plantation that bred its own destruction. It was one of many pieces of evidence abolitionists used to argue that slavery was not just economically wrong, but morally monstrous, that the institution corrupted everyone it touched, that it created the very violence it claimed to fear. Solomon lived. He made it to Ohio, settled in a small town outside Cleveland, and took the name Samuel Freeman, the same name Samson would later choose. Though neither knew the other had picked it, Solomon worked as a blacksmith, the trade he'd learned in slavery, the skill that had both cursed and saved him. He married, had 2 children, lived quietly, but once a year, on May 14th, he would close his shop and spend the day in silence, remembering, mourning, celebrating. In 1887, when he was 55 years old, Solomon gave a deposition to a historian studying the slave experience. It was recorded, but not published until the 1960s, when his grandchildren found it and shared it. In that deposition, Solomon spoke for the first time in detail about everything: the experiments, the planning, the murders, Magnolia, the other 6 men, the decade of patience, the 47 minutes of revenge. The historian asked him, "Do you regret it?" Solomon's answer was preserved on the recording: "Regret. No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret the system that made it necessary. I regret that human beings had to become killers to reclaim their humanity. But the act itself, killing Cornelius Blackwood and his sons and the overseers? No, that was justice. Bloody, terrible justice, but justice nonetheless. They had the law on their side, so we had to become the law. They had all the power, so we had to take it. They gave us no choice. And when you give people no choice but to fight or die as slaves, some of us will choose to fight, every time." He paused, then added, "Magnolia was the bravest of all of us. She was white, which means, in another world, she could have been safe. But she chose us, chose our cause, chose to die free rather than live in the cage he built for her. She was our sister in every way that mattered. And I'm honored I got to know her. Honored I got to give her peace at the end." Solomon died in 1889, 57 years old, in his own home, in his own bed, surrounded by family who loved him. A free man, a man who had lived 22 years as a slave and 35 as a free person. His death certificate listed his occupation as blacksmith, his name as Samuel Freeman. It did not say murderer. It did not say fugitive. It did not say property. It said blacksmith, and that was enough. The Blackwood Massacre, as it came to be known, had ripples that extended far beyond the 8 people who planned it. In Alabama and across the Deep South, the incident caused widespread panic. For weeks, plantation owners slept with loaded guns. They increased patrols. They tightened restrictions. Some freed their slaves early, afraid of suffering Blackwood's fate. Others became more brutal, trying to terrorize their enslaved people into submission. But the damage was done. The idea had been planted. Slaves could fight back, could win, could kill their masters and escape. In the 16 months between the Blackwood Massacre and the end of the Civil War, there were 14 other documented plantation murders in Alabama alone. Some were individual acts, a field hand killing an overseer, a house slave poisoning a mistress. Some were small-scale uprisings. None were as elaborate or as coordinated as Blackwood, but every one of them was inspired by it. The massacre proved something many whites had feared and many blacks had hoped. The enslaved were not content, were not docile, were not accepting of their condition. They were waiting, planning, ready to fight. For the abolitionist movement, the Blackwood Massacre was complicated. On one hand, it provided powerful evidence of slavery's brutality. Cornelius's journal excerpts, published in northern newspapers, shocked even people who had tolerated slavery. The details of his experiments, of what he did to his own wife, of the babies he murdered, it was undeniable proof that slavery corrupted absolutely. On the other hand, the violence of the revenge was difficult to defend. 11 people killed in a single night, some of them tortured, mutilated. The brutality was hard to justify, even for those who supported the cause. Frederick Douglass addressed the massacre in a speech in Boston in August 1864. Do I condone the violence at Blackwood Plantation? No, violence is always a tragedy. But do I understand it? Yes, do I recognize it as the natural, inevitable result of a system that denies human beings every right, every dignity, every hope? Absolutely. When you chain people for generations, when you torture and rape and kill with impunity, when you make law itself an instrument of oppression, you create the very violence you claim to fear. The men who killed Cornelius Blackwood did not become murderers in a vacuum. They were made into killers by a system that left them no other recourse. If you want to prevent such massacres, end slavery. Give people the freedom they deserve. Stop creating the conditions that make desperate people commit desperate acts. The speech was controversial, but it resonated. The Blackwood Massacre became a talking point in abolitionist circles, an example of how slavery corrupted everyone. It touched and created cycles of violence that benefited no one. When the Civil War ended in April 1865 and slavery was abolished. By the 13th Amendment in December 1865, the Blackwood Plantation site remained abandoned. No one wanted to rebuild there. The land was said to be cursed. For decades it sat empty, the ruins of the big house slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and pine trees. Local people avoided it, said it was haunted, said you could hear screaming on May nights. Said the ghosts of the Blackwoods wandered the property, still suffering, still paying for their crimes. Whether that's true or not, the land has never been successfully farmed again. Every attempt to rebuild or cultivate failed. Crops wouldn't grow. Animals wouldn't stay. Workers would quit, saying they felt watched, felt oppressed, felt a weight on the land that couldn't be lifted. Today, the Blackwood Plantation site is an overgrown forest in Lowndes County, Alabama. There's a small historical marker placed in 1995 that reads, Site of Blackwood Plantation, established 1798, scene of slave uprising, May 14, 1864, 11 killed, plantation destroyed. This site serves as reminder of the violence inherent in slavery and the human cost of oppression. It doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't name Solomon, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, Samson, Cato, or Jupiter. It doesn't name Magnolia. It doesn't explain the experiments, the torture, the decade of patient revenge, but the descendants of Blackwood Plantation slaves know the full story. It's been passed down through oral tradition for 6 generations. And in the 1960s, when Solomon's deposition was discovered, when Magnolia's ledger copies surfaced in abolitionist archives, when the full truth finally came out, the story became part of the larger narrative of resistance. The Blackwood 8, the 7 men and 1 woman who said enough and backed it up with blood, are now recognized in certain historical circles as symbols of resistance. Not heroes exactly. The violence is too complicated for that, but symbols of what happens when oppression goes too far, when human beings are pushed past their breaking point, when the law offers no justice and people create their own. There are lessons here. Lessons about oppression and resistance, about violence and justice, about what happens when systems of power become so corrupt, so brutal, so dehumanizing, that the only response left is destruction. The lesson is not that violence is good. It never is. Every death is a tragedy. Every act of brutality, no matter how justified, leaves scars. The lesson is that oppression creates its own destroyers, that you cannot enslave, torture, rape, and murder people for generations and expect them to stay peaceful. That when you deny people every legal avenue of justice, some of them will create illegal ones. That when you build a system on violence, you should not be surprised when violence destroys it. Cornelius Blackwood created the 7 men who killed him. He forged them in trauma and rage and humiliation. He gave them every reason to hate him and no reason to spare him. And then he acted surprised when they did exactly what he trained them to do: fight back. The same is true on a larger scale. The institution of slavery created its own resistance. The brutality of the system ensured that some people would always fight back, always resist, always refuse to accept their chains. The civil war that freed the slaves was, in many ways, the Blackwood Massacre writ large, a violent confrontation between oppressor and oppressed, with massive death tolls and massive destruction. Because that's what happens when oppression becomes unsustainable and people refuse to live enslaved. Today, more than 160 years later, we're still grappling with the legacy of slavery. The systems of oppression didn't end in 1865. They evolved, became Jim Crow, became segregation, became mass incarceration, became systemic racism that still denies opportunity, still takes lives, still creates the conditions where desperate people commit desperate acts. The Blackwood 8 are long dead, but their story remains relevant, because the question they faced, what do you do when the system offers no justice, when oppression is legal, when violence is the only language power understands, is a question people still face, and the answer they gave: we fight back. We reclaim our humanity. We refuse to die as slaves, even if it means dying as rebels, is an answer that still resonates. This is not a story about heroes. It's a story about human beings pushed to the absolute limit, about people who made a terrible choice because all their other choices had been taken away, about the consequences of building a society on oppression and expecting it to last forever. It's a story that America tried to bury, that historians ignored for a century, that even today makes people uncomfortable because it forces us to confront truths we'd rather avoid. But it's a true story. It happened. On May 14, 1864, in Lowndes County, Alabama, 8 people, 7 black men and 1 white woman who had been reduced to slavery by her own husband, killed 11 people, burned a plantation to the ground, and scattered into the night seeking freedom. Some of them died for it. Some of them lived free. All of them changed history in their own small way. Remember their names: Solomon, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, Samson, Cato, Jupiter, and Magnolia. Remember what they endured. Remember what they did. Remember what it cost them. And remember that freedom has always been won by people who refused to accept chains, who paid terrible prices, who made brutal choices because they lived in brutal times. This is American history. The real history, the uncomfortable history, the history that forces us to confront what slavery really was and what it took to end it. Remember the Blackwood 8, and never forget that oppression always creates its own resistance, and that those who sow violence will reap it in measures they cannot control. The legacy that wouldn't die. In 1923, nearly 60 years after the massacre, a journalist named Margaret Beaumont traveled to Alabama researching a book on plantation life. She interviewed elderly former slaves, now in their 80s and 90s, gathering oral histories that had never been recorded. In a small cabin outside Hayneville, she met a woman named Ruth Freeman, age 87. Ruth was Solomon's daughter. Ruth had been only 5 years old when her father died, but she remembered the stories he told, the ones he only shared with family, late at night, when no white people could overhear, the full truth about Blackwood Plantation. Margaret's interview with Ruth was never published in her lifetime. It was too controversial, too violent, too complicated for 1920s America to process, but the transcript survived, hidden in Margaret's papers, discovered by her granddaughter in 1998 and donated to the Smithsonian. In that interview, Ruth said something that captures the entire meaning of the Blackwood Massacre. "My daddy told me he wasn't proud of killing. Said it haunted him every day of his life. Said he could still see Cornelius Blackwood's face, still hear the sounds, still smell the blood. Said it broke something in him that never fully healed, but he also said he'd do it again, because living as a slave was dying slowly every single day. And at least that night, at least in those hours, he was fully alive, fully human, making his own choices, taking back his own power. He said freedom isn't always clean. Sometimes it's bloody. Sometimes it costs more than you want to pay, but it's always worth it, because even one day of freedom is worth more than a lifetime of chains." And he said Miss Magnolia, he always called her Miss Magnolia, even though she asked them not to, she was the bravest soul he ever knew, because she had a choice. She was white. If she'd stayed silent, stayed compliant, she could have survived, maybe even escaped eventually. But she chose to stand with them, chose to fight with them, chose to die with them. Daddy said that was real courage. Not the absence of fear, but doing what's right even when it costs you everything. He told me to remember their names, all 8 of them, to tell my children, to pass the story down. He said history tries to bury the complicated truths, tries to make everything simple. Good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. But real life isn't like that. Real life is people in impossible situations, making terrible choices because all the good choices were taken away. He said to remember them not as saints, but as human beings, flawed, broken by trauma, but ultimately, finally, briefly, free. The story of the Blackwood 8 was largely forgotten by mainstream history for over a century. It didn't fit the narrative that either side wanted to tell. The South didn't want to remember it because it contradicted their mythology of the happy slave and the benevolent master. It proved that slavery was violent, that slaves hated their condition, that given the opportunity they would kill their oppressors. The North didn't want to remember it because the violence was too brutal, too uncontrolled. Abolitionists could point to peaceful resistance, to slave narratives, to legal arguments. But a massacre, that was harder to use as propaganda, so the story faded, became local legend in Alabama. Whispered about, but not documented. Passed down in black families, but not taught in schools. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that scholars began seriously researching slave resistance. Historians like John Hope Franklin and Herbert Aptheca started documenting the hundreds of slave rebellions, uprisings, and acts of individual resistance that had been erased from the historical record. In 1964, exactly 100 years after the massacre, a graduate student at Howard University named Thomas Washington wrote his thesis on the Blackwood Plantation incident. He tracked down descendants of the 8 conspirators. He found copies of Magnolia's ledger in abolitionist archives. He located Solomon's 1887 deposition. For the first time, the full story was documented academically, published, made part of the historical record. His thesis was titled The Blackwood Conspiracy, Interracial Resistance and the Violence of Freedom in Civil War, Alabama. It was controversial. Some historians praised it as groundbreaking research into an overlooked aspect of slave resistance. Others criticized it for glorifying violence. The debate raged in academic circles for years, but the story was out. It couldn't be buried again. In 1995, the historical marker was placed at the Blackwood site. It was a compromise, acknowledging what happened without fully explaining it, recognizing the violence without examining its causes. In 2014, on the 150th anniversary of the massacre, a group of descendants of Blackwood slaves held a memorial service at the site. About 80 people attended, black descendants of the enslaved, a few white descendants of neighboring plantations, historians, civil rights activists. They held the ceremony at midnight, the exact time the revenge had begun. They read the names of the 8 conspirators. They read the names of the 11 who died. They read from Magnolia's ledger the documented crimes that had made the violence feel necessary, and they planted 8 trees. 7 oak trees for the 7 men, 1 magnolia tree for the woman who joined them, a descendant of Solomon, his great-great-great-grandson. A lawyer from Ohio named Marcus Freeman gave a speech. We gather here not to celebrate violence, but to remember truth. The truth that slavery was violence. That every day, every hour, every minute of slavery was an act of violence against human beings. That the law itself was violent, that the system was violent, that the society was violent, and when violence is all around you, when violence is the only language the powerful speak, when violence is legal and sanctioned and celebrated as long as it flows in one direction, eventually someone will speak that language back. My ancestor Solomon killed a man with his hands, slowly, brutally. I don't condone it, but I understand it, because that man had tortured him for 10 years, had forced him to do unspeakable things, had murdered babies in front of him, had destroyed his humanity piece by piece. At some point, the human spirit says enough, and it fights back with whatever weapons it has. We're not here to say Solomon was right. We're here to say Solomon was human, that he reached his breaking point, that he and 7 others decided dying free was better than living enslaved, and that the society that created the conditions for that choice, that society was the real monster. So we remember, not to glorify, not to justify, but to understand, to learn, to ensure we never build a society so brutal, so oppressive, so violent that it leaves human beings no choice but to become killers themselves. We remember the Blackwood 8, and we commit ourselves to building a world where no one ever has to make that choice again. The speech was filmed and posted online. It went viral. Millions watched it. The debate reignited about violence and resistance, about justice and revenge, about what people are justified in doing when the system offers them no recourse. Some viewers called Solomon and the others heroes. Some called them murderers. Most recognized the truth was somewhere in between, that they were human beings in an inhuman situation, that their actions were both understandable and terrible, that the real villain was the system of slavery itself. The question that remains, the story of the Blackwood 8, forces us to confront an uncomfortable question that's as relevant today as it was in 1864. What do you do when the system is the oppressor? When the law protects your abuser, what recourse do you have? When the courts won't hear your case, when the police enforce your oppression, when society celebrates your suffering, what options remain? The answer should be reform the system. Change the laws. Build a more just society. But what if the system won't reform? What if those in power refuse to change? What if decades or generations pass and nothing improves? That's the situation the Blackwood 8 faced. Slavery wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made escape harder. Southern states were passing increasingly brutal laws. The plantation economy was expanding, not contracting. There was no legal path to freedom, no court that would hear their case, no law that would protect them, no authority that would help. So they made their own justice, with blood and fire and violence that still makes us uncomfortable 160 years later. And the uncomfortable truth is, it worked. Not for all of them. 3 died. Others lived in hiding forever. But some survived. Some lived free. And all of them, even those who were caught and executed, died on their own terms, having struck back at the system that tried to destroy them. Does that make it right? No, violence is never right. Every death is a tragedy. Every act of brutality, no matter how justified, diminishes our humanity. But does it make it understandable? Yes. Does it make sense as a response to centuries of systemic violence? Yes. Does it teach us something important about what happens when oppression becomes unbearable? Absolutely. The lesson of Blackwood is not that violence is the answer. It's that oppression creates the conditions where violence becomes inevitable. That if you build a society on brutality, some people will eventually fight back brutally. That you cannot enslave people forever and expect them to stay peaceful. Echoes in modern American 2020. During the protests following George Floyd's murder, someone spray-painted a message on the abandoned historical marker at the Blackwood site. They fought back, so do we. Remember the Blackwood 8. The connection was clear. The systemic oppression of slavery had evolved but not ended. The violence of the state against black bodies continued in different forms, and people were still fighting back, still resisting, still refusing to accept injustice. The graffiti was quickly removed by local authorities, but not before photos spread across social media. The Blackwood Eight became symbols again, this time for a new generation. Young activists researched the story, created art inspired by it, drew parallels between Solomon's impossible choice in 1864 and the impossible choices Black Americans still face today. Comply with a system that devalues your life, or resist and risk everything. The debates that followed were intense. Some argued that comparing 19th century slavery to 21st century racism minimized the horrors of slavery. Others argued that the through line of oppression was clear, different tools, same result, but everyone agreed on one thing: the story of the Blackwood Eight matters. Not because violence is right, but because understanding why it happened is essential to preventing it from happening again. The final testimony in 2019. Researchers at the University of Alabama discovered one final document related to the Blackwood Massacre. It was a letter written by Magnolia Blackwood in 1863. Hidden in the walls of the big house and somehow surviving the fire, it was addressed to whoever finds this, and apparently written as insurance if the conspiracy failed. If they were all killed, she wanted someone to know the truth. The letter reads, "In part, I write this knowing I may never see freedom, knowing the plan may fail, knowing we may all die for what we're about to do, but I write it because the truth must be preserved, because someone must know what really happened here, because history is written by victors, and we may not be victors. My name is Magnolia Blackwood. I was born Magnolia Ashford in 1828. I was sold into marriage at age 16 to settle my father's debts. I thought I was becoming a wife. I became a prisoner. For 20 years my husband has used me as an experiment, has forced 7 men, good men, brave men, innocent men, to violate me while he watched and documented, has murdered 2 babies born from those forced couplings, has destroyed 8 lives in service of his sick curiosity about race and breeding. I'm writing to say, we are not animals. The 7 men he tortured are not animals. They are heroes who endured hell to protect their families. They did what they were forced to do, and they hated themselves for it. And they should not have to hate themselves because the evil is not theirs. It is his. It has always been his. When we act, and we will act, I know we will, history will call us murderers, savages, monsters. But we are not monsters. We are people who were treated as less than human and who finally said, no more. We are people who chose to die free rather than live as slaves. We are people who did terrible things because terrible things were done to us first, and there was no other way out. If you find this, know that every word in my husband's journal is true, every crime documented, every horror real, and know that what we did in response, whatever it was, however brutal, was born from 2 decades of systematic torture and dehumanization. Judge us if you must, but judge the system that created us first. We did not choose this. We chose only how we would respond to it, and we chose freedom, whatever the cost. Magnolia Blackwood, October 15th, 1863. The letter was authenticated by multiple experts. It's now housed in the Library of Congress, part of the permanent collection on American slavery. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final testimony from one of the 8, and it reframes everything, not as a story of unprovoked violence, but as the final chapter in a 20-year horror story, the last act of people who had endured everything and could endure no more. This story doesn't have a clean ending. Real history never does. The Blackwood Eight killed 11 people in a night of revenge that was both terrifying and understandable. Some of them died for it. Some lived free. All of them carried the weight of what they'd done for the rest of their lives. The plantation they destroyed is gone, replaced by forest. The dynasty they ended left no descendants. Cornelius's line died with his sons. The ledger of crimes is preserved in archives. The truth has finally been told. But the questions remain. When is violence justified? When oppression is total and legal recourse doesn't exist, what should people do? How do we remember historical figures who did terrible things for understandable reasons? What's the difference between revenge and justice? These are not easy questions, They don't have simple answers. But the story of the Blackwood Eight forces us to grapple with them honestly, because at the end of the day, 8 people, 7 black men enslaved and 1 white woman enslaved in a different way, made a choice. They chose dignity over survival, freedom over safety, justice over life. They paid dearly for that choice. But they made it with open eyes, knowing the cost, accepting it, and in doing so, they added their names to the long, complicated, difficult history of resistance. They became part of the story of how slavery ended, not peacefully, not easily, but through blood and fire and the refusal of enslaved people to accept their chains. Remember their names: Solomon, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, Samson, Cato, Jupiter, Magnolia. Remember what was done to them. Remember how they fought back. Remember that freedom has always required sacrifice. Remember that oppression always, eventually, creates its own destroyers. This is American history, the real history, the uncomfortable history that forces us to confront hard truths about our past and present. If this story moved you, disturbed you, made you think, made you question, good. That's what history should do. It should challenge us. It should make us uncomfortable. It should force us to grapple with complexity instead of hiding behind simplistic narratives. Leave your like if this story impacted you. Comment with your thoughts. Was this justice or murder? What would you have done in their situation? How should we remember people who did terrible things in response to terrible oppression? Share this video so others can learn this history that's been buried for too long. Subscribe for more stories that mainstream history forgot. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode, because these stories matter. These lives matter. This truth matters. The Blackwood Eight lived. They suffered. They fought back. They died free or lived free, and we remember them not as heroes, not as villains, but as human beings who refuse to accept less than humanity, whatever the cost. This is their legacy. This is their truth. This is their story. Never forgotten. Always remembered. Forever free.